if you think about, let's say, Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, right? There's a sense in which, who are they? Right? And Dan, you're the expert conservative historian, but there's a sense in which, for Reagan, the ideas did kind of come first. ISI was founded in 1953, National Review in 1955. They weren't totally fleshed out. There was a lot of tensions and back and forth on the pages of these publications at these institutions. But then eventually, Barry Goldwater didn't work out too well, but eventually Reagan came along and kind of embodied the principles that had been hashed out before. Trump is sort of the opposite in this. Well, you had sort of a Pat Buchanan, kind of a voice crying in the wilderness on a lot of these issues several decades before. Politically, no one really took them up. And then when Donald Trump came down the escalator in 2015, all of a sudden these, the immigration issue, the foreign policy issue, the making things in America, the manufacturing issue, all of these things, right? He articulated them, the entire kind of intellectual infrastructure on the right, at first, mostly, not entirely, but mostly repudiated it. And then when he won, right, there were conferences organized. There were all sorts of meetings to figure out, what is this? Let's create an intellectual infrastructure and credential people and whatever. Teach we've discovered Pat Buchanan again. Oh, wow, we discover Alexander Hamilton.
Andrew Jackson,
right? And so there's a sense in which the intellectual ideas around the current Trump presidency came after the action of the individual man. And will probably live on because will become institutionalized.
But I do think there is a resemblance, actually, between Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. And you're quite right that Ronald Reagan was much more of a reader. He was going to be very interested in Ludwig von Mises. President Trump, probably not so much. But what Ronald Reagan was doing with those ideas during his own lifetime was just as unpopular as what Donald Trump is doing with his set of ideas now. So back in Reagan's own time, to say that you were interested in Ludwig von Mises, it was literally very much like saying that you are a Make America Healthy Again sort of RFK person today. Ludwig von Mises and the Austrian School of Economics was considered to be as crackpot, as far out as any anti-vaccine ideology today. So Reagan was considered anti-intellectual during his own lifetime. And even though he was reading these books, they were not the books that were taken seriously by the Keynesian establishment within higher education. Now, Trump, I think both Reagan and Trump were men of the moment in a way. They recognized, but men of the moment who understood that the moment was wrong. They understood that what had become the conventional wisdom of their own time had not always been true. And that in fact, saying that we must have globalization, we must have free trade in the Trump era now, Trump said, well, you know what? I actually know that there was a time when we took building things in America seriously. And there was a time when we were worried about Japan stealing our lunch. And now China clearly is doing so. And that we were actually right back then when we had those concerns. And we have not been right in the last 20 to 25 years when we have been deferring to this idea of fate, right? This inevitability of globalization. This idea it is a world system. It is, it's almost the ekpyrosis. Now it's not the Stoic idea of the natural trajectory of the universe ending in a conclusion, but it's this warped, post-Hegelian Francis Fukuyama version of an end of history.
A warped theodicy, we might say.
Yes, exactly, to which we must, that's right, to which we must all defer. And Trump said, no, I as an individual can actually say no to that. America as a country can say no to that. And Reagan actually in his own time was also defying the tide of what was considered to be the inevitable, direction of history. Because back then, it's a little bit of an exaggeration to say that the Soviet Union by the mid 20th century was seen as the wave of the future. That's a bit, a little earlier it was, but certainly not by the 50s and 60s. Nevertheless, there was this idea that, something about the Soviet Union was correct and that the West would have to move somewhat in the direction of that form, not necessarily the totalitarianism, but certainly this idea of a comprehensive, state that would be able to run the economy very well. We'd have to do it in a Western way rather than a Soviet way, but this was seen to be the inevitable wave of history. And Reagan said, no, it's not. And in fact, there was a better way of doing things before, and there will be a better and different way after this as well, after me. And Trump, I think, is the same way. He says this idea of an inevitable, intellectually respectable direction of history that has been approved by all of the economics departments, by all of the international law scholars who say you can't do this, you can't do that, that the world must go in the direction of uniform liberal democracy. Trump is resisting that as well. So it's a case, and there, I think Thomas Carlyle is a touchstone worth pointing to here. Not because everything that Carlyle said would be wise, but rather he understood this role of the individual in history, and that they are what you need to break out of a convention which in fact is mistaken for being a permanent philosophical truth, but really is nothing more than just a fad, a clique that has been adopted by the powers that be today.
Thank you for watching this clip of Project Cosmos. If you'd like to watch the full video, the link is in the description below.